Welcome to the Voice of Retail for the week of May 20th, 2019. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada and sponsored by Purolator, Canada's shipping company for courier and freight. Learn more at purolator.com. In this episode, a feature interview with retailer Sinéad Clarke at her wonderful store, the Irish Design House in Toronto. We talk about the journey that brought her to Canada and the passion she brings to her business. Next, an interview with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director, Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University and frequent commentator on the grocery sector in Canada, talking about his background and approach and discussing the upcoming legalization of cannabis edibles, as Sylvain tells us that the government is taking the fun out of edibles. Last but not least, part one of my interview with Karl, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at Retail Council of Canada, on his journey to the most senior levels of government and advocacy. And we start covering off key issues for retailers in Canada, including the new Nafta, CUSMA, as it's known here in Canada, agreement. Last but not least, I'll cover off the top retail news of the week, including grocery retailers doubling down on delivery, Endy stays the course, Roots debuts on the Magic Mile, Ontario moving closer to Suds and C-stores, store keynote speaker Steve Dennis is waiting for the penny to drop, with or without a silver bullet, cannabis retailers play Flip That permit in Saskatchewan, and the Healthy Planet plans multi-year expansion. First, let's listen into my interview with Sinéad from the Irish Design House. Sinéad, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you today?
I'm very well, Michael, and thank you for having me.
So you had a bit of excitement this afternoon here at the Irish Design House. You had a ministerial visit.
Yes, we did. We had some ministers come from Ireland. They're here for, I think, 48 hours to visit Toronto and Canada and talk about the trade that there is going on right now between Ireland and Canada.
I was struck by when the minister walked in, Mr. Pat Breen walked in, he said, I feel like I'm back in Ireland. I'm touring all over North America.
Felt like he was back in County Clare.
He did. Tell me about your journey here to Toronto and tell me about your store.
So our journey is a little bit of a strange one because we kind of made it up as we went along. Originally back in 2013, myself and my partner arrived to Toronto. We called it Toronto at the time. We weren't sure how it was pronounced. And we were on a 2-year working permit, which allowed us to work and travel for 2 years within Canada. And
why did you choose... you could go a lot of places.
Why did we choose to Toronto or why did we choose Canada? Well, Canada was always on my mind. I don't really know why. I know a little bit why, but I didn't know people here as such. I knew one couple, but not very well. But I guess when I was self-employed back in Ireland, I would, on Saturdays, trade in a very well-known area called Temple Bar in Dublin. And there was this gorgeous little food and craft market. And I, as a clothing and knitwear maker, would set up a booth every Saturday, rain, hail or shine. I did it for 6 years. And during my Saturdays at this market, I would meet tourists from all over the world who would come to Ireland, and of course they would come to Temple Bar. It's this famous area in Dublin, and then we get chatting. I would meet Japanese tourists, American tourists, but quite a lot of Canadian tourists who would say, oh my God, your products would do really, really well, and they would say Toronto and name out different parts of Canada. So I guess over the years that was on my mind.
Kind of stuck with you.
It kind of stuck with me, and I thought, well, that would be an interesting place to visit. I've never been. And because I was self-employed, I didn't want to travel as such and leave my business behind and forget about it. I really wanted to bring it with me. It was a big part of who I was and what I built up. It was still a teeny tiny little brand, but it was mine and I loved it and I loved working with it. And we discussed coming to Canada for a year, looked into the visa, and at that time it just went through a change in 2012 from a 1-year visa, and it's now offering a 2-year visa to come. So we thought, let's go, see what happens.
Right. And now here you are.
Here we are, almost 6 years later. We came in September 2013, so it's almost 6 years, and stumbled upon this lovely neighbourhood that we're in right now called Leslieville. Rented a little apartment. A couple of months later, saw a space around the corner that was available for rent. We had played around with the idea of opening a pop-up store, selling my own clothing brand and maybe bringing in some of my friends' work and the other artists from this market in Temple Bar, just as a 6-month project, something to kind of get it out of my system. I really wanted to do it. And here we are now, fast forward 5 years later. The store is almost 5 years is what I mean. It's almost 6 years later in Canada, but 5 years later we have this amazing store. selling 80 Irish brands, all handmade. Majority are artisan brands. Some are a little bit more established and are bigger brands. And I also have expanded my own, what was little clothing line. Now I'm making quite a few pieces per year, 2 collections every year, and that is all designed here at the store. And I have a really great production seamstresses and fitters who work on the collection with me, and together we put it together entirely here in the city and we sell it in the store.
You know, these are interesting times in retail where we have retailers being very successful and some not being successful. Retail overall is strong, but we talked about before about the difference between online and physical retail. You've got an online store, but you find that most people really want to experience your store in person.
I feel they do because, I mean, there's a lot of elements. Possibly our website is lovely. It's basic, but it doesn't maybe have enough interactive things going on it where you can see all the colour options and all the brands like the big brands do. I think online shoppers are very used to seeing, you know, everything being very precise and very easily informed on a website. So there's a lot of work, I guess, we need to do on the website. But that being said, we're a craft store, we're a handmade store, so our clothing and our pieces are very different and they're very unique. There may only be one of one dress, two of another. So people do tend to like to come in and see it for themselves.
And it's really hard to convey the passion and enthusiasm online, right?
I mean, I spoke to you before about customers who have come across the store, whether they've accidentally Googled something and then found our store, or whether they've purposely Googled and tried to search for an Irish store in the area and then found us. I'm not sure. But when they do find us, sometimes people have driven up to 3 hours to come here and to experience the store, and very excited to see lots of Irish products in their home country. So that's a really nice thing for me to experience with them.
What have you learned in the years? You did two big things, right? One, move countries, and two, start a retail store, even though you had presence, but not like a physical retail store. What's been the biggest, I guess, surprise to you or learning in the years that you've been operating the store? I
haven't had any bad surprises. I've had good surprises, you know. I mean, I guess the surprise is the hard work. I mean, I did have a business before, but like you said, I didn't have a store before. So the one thing now is the commitment to be here during the opening hours, 7 days a week. So that's a huge commitment. But, you know, it's 5 years later, I'm growing and the store is growing, and we've got some staff now who are all Irish girls, which is amazing. I mean, it's all a learning experience, really. I genuinely am very passionate about it. So there are times when you or other people may have thought, okay, this is too much, I'm just going to call it quits. But me being possibly stubborn. But that aside with, I've worked very hard from the very beginning, getting into fashion school as a young girl and succeeding and making my way through, and then setting up my brand in Ireland in 2007, and then moving here. I don't want something to now get in the way. I'm so close to having what I've always wanted, and never thought it would be in Canada, never thought it would be exactly this model, but here I am. I consider myself very, very lucky. So I think we're coming into some changing times for sure, because the online market is going to increase. Rents in this particular neighbourhood are increasing really, really high. It's
a tough part of the paradox of success, right? So you want to be in a neighbourhood that's popular, but at the same time, sometimes that comes with it, increased in rents. But the minister. One of the things the minister was talking about here was CETA, this trade agreement between Canada and the EU, and I think that's helped you.
It's
a
really
bit
helped
in some
us.
of your product, right?
Originally, we would. I would buy all the different products. They would arrive by courier, by mail, however, into Canada and then to the store. Each vendor that we bought from would have invoices on the outside of the box declaring what were the contents, and customs would then put a value on each shipping box. So, for example, if I was importing textiles, woolen textiles, whether it be blankets or sweaters, the tariff was 23%. If I was importing soaps, it was much lower. It was 6%. So I could calculate in my head, but when the box arrived with the delivery man, I would have to pay an
cash
on delivery, not for the delivery, but this was an extra tariff just because it was an import tariff.
And that's mostly, not all, but 99% of that's eliminated now?
I don't know exactly how much, but it's pretty much eliminated now.
Though,
So, which is amazing, because originally, I know we spoke about this too, but I would try and keep my retail price as close as possible with the conversion to the retail price in Ireland, just so there wasn't a huge jump. But that meant by the time I took out, the cost of the garment, the cost of shipping in here, and the import taxes, we weren't left with very much.
And it's very impossible, or next to impossible, to explain to customers, well, there's a tariff on it. That,
and I never went into that at all with my customers. I thought, we're setting this up. It may only be short term. So let's just roll with it, sell our products, see what happens. And then now October last year, so it would have been October 2018, the CETA agreement was finalised and initialised immediately, and now I don't have to pay these huge import fees. So although my retail price has remained the same, the store can keep some more money.
Yes, make sure you employ people and
so that's
pay the
our
rent
next step now
is
starting employing somebody and getting some help. Again, we're at the very bottom, very, very small business, starting with no backing or no funding. It's just all our own little pennies. Yeah. But we're at the stage now that it has grown and we do need some help. And so that's what the money can go towards. Well, it's
a wonderfully merchandised store. It's congratulations. Tell us before we go where people can find your store.
We are at Queen and Broadview, which is on the east end of Toronto. Our location is 756 Queen Street East, and we're just on the north side of the street.
You have what's your website address in case they're not?
So the store is called we call ourselves the IDH, but the Irish Design House, and our website is theIrishDesignHouse.com.
Well, Sinead, thanks for spending some time with the Voice of Retail. It was a real treat to meet you, and I wish you much success.
Thank you so much, Michael.
We'll be right back.
This is Steve Dennis. After more than a 20-year career as a senior executive at brands like Neiman Marcus, I'm now a consultant, speaker, and Forbes contributing writer on what it takes to reinvent retail in the age of digital disruption. And the good news is that physical retail isn't dead. The bad news is that boring retail most certainly is. So I hope you'll join me at Store 2019 to hear my unique take on the state of modern retail. As the lines between digital and physical blur, and as consumer preferences evolve, retailers need to reimagine their customer experience, often radically. In my keynote, you'll discover what brands around the world are doing to transform their business to be more remarkable, and you'll learn 8 killer strategies so you don't wind up stuck in the boring middle. That's Store 2019, May 28th and 29th in Toronto. Learn more and get your tickets now at storeconference.ca.
Sylvain, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you this morning?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's such a treat to be able to speak to you. I think you're the busiest man in show business, as the saying goes. You're crisscrossing the country talking about food and the grocery industry, and I wish I had 3 or 4 hours to chat with you. Perhaps we'll break our interview up into a couple of things through the year. But let's get started on a little bit about yourself, because a lot of people certainly in this industry know of you, but tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to do what you do today.
Well, so I grew up in Farnham, Quebec, surrounded by farms, so I basically worked on farms all my youth, and later on in life, after starting a couple of businesses, went back to school, ended up becoming an academic. That was 25 years ago, I guess now. And as I was going through my graduate studies, I was mentored basically back to agriculture and agri-food. And that's kind of what happened. And in 1998, when I started my academic career, food traceability wasn't even a word. It wasn't a recognized word. And my thesis was actually on traceability, and And so that's why I focus so much on food distribution. And of course, I also look at policies. Governments tend to impact how industry behaves, of course. And my rise to stardom, if you will, was the mad cow crisis. That was the first one back in 2003. The second, I would say, the second push. Where I got really busy was in 2008 with the listeria crisis at Maple Leaf. And after that, it just went on and on and on, one situation after another. And so that's why I do travel a lot. I speak at several events. I do a lot of work with both industry and government. This week I was with industry. Next week I'm with government. And so, I cover a lot of ground, but in order to really appreciate food systems, I think you do have to get out of the lab and really talk to business folks and policymakers, so you have a better sense of what's happening and what is about to happen as well.
Well, I think the interesting thing I find about your background, not only do you have food science, but 3 basically business degrees, so you really come at it with a lens of understanding the business perspective. And, you know, as Retail Council of Canada often says, you know, a lot of time you're in speaking with government, you're explaining the unintended consequences of
exactly, and of course I do.
Regulations.
Absolutely, and I do have a bias towards business, of course, because and I often find myself as the only social scientist around the table, particularly in Ottawa. And when I work with different provinces, most of the time food scientists are hired, microbiologists, different folks, nutritionists, dietitians. But rarely people think of social scientists as valuable researchers to really help society get a better understanding of what's happening. And so that's kind of how I position myself, and I always try to advocate in favor of the social sciences and humanities as I actually interact with different folks.
Let's talk about now some of the great work you're doing, and I wanted to start with some recent work you issued around cannabis edibles. I've covered in the Voice of Retail several times, covering the cannabis beat. It's such an interesting industry that's evolving, and you spoke specifically last week some research on edibles, which may or may not see the light of day by the end of this year. Tell us what you learned in the most recent study that you did.
Yeah, so we released our study a little over a week now, and we've conducted I think well over 50 interviews. Our market reach was over 40 million. So a lot of people inquired about our study, and in fact, we're scheduled now to work with both public safety and agriculture in Ottawa. They've asked us to go to Ottawa and brief them on what we've been working on, and essentially the study that we published last week was a follow-up to a study we published 2 years ago, which kind of led to a change in Bill C-45. At the time in 2017, edibles weren't included in the bill, and it was only after we presented our findings that the committee actually decided to make an amendment. I think it was presented by the Liberals at the time, to change the bill, Bill C-45, and now we're months away from seeing edibles become legal, and which is why we thought it was perhaps a good idea to go back to field and see and assess public sentiment in general and see where Canadians are at.
I think the general consensus was that, I think from the perspective of government, that they wanted to go slower than faster on edibles, and some learnings there from south of the border in the States where it's legal. And it's a more complex issue than it feels, and it feels right in your wheelhouse. It's a more complex issue than is smoking. On the one hand, the industry, I think, believes that edibles are one big path to legitimacy, to destigmatization. You know, the government's worked for many years to get people to stop smoking. Now all you can do is smoke or, use different oils. But on the one hand, it's a path to the legitimization, perhaps. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things that could trip up both public policy and consumers. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you think the pacing is right? And where do you think the government is headed and public policy is headed regarding edibles?
Well, is the pacing right? It depends who you talk to, I guess. If you talk to government, I think they actually, Health Canada, starting with Health Canada, I think the department is actually pleased with how things are progressing. I think many months ago, the one main goal Health Canada had was to legalize cannabis without normalizing it. And that's exactly what we're getting. If you actually look at the regulatory framework as presented, and that's likely going to be the version which will be adopted by Parliament and will receive royal assent later on this year, days before the federal election, they actually are treating edibles like a drug. It's not an ingredient incorporated into food. It is a drug. And so that's why they're asking, say, manufacturers to separate their manufacturing operations. If they are to produce an edible product, it has to be completely physically separated in a separate building. The packaging rules are quite strict. They're basically taking the fun out of edibles, and that's exactly what they wanted. So 3 years ago, I think Canadians felt they were invited to some mega party with great music, balloons, only to end up in some church basement with lousy music. That's kind of how it feels right now.
Let's talk about. So in the study, the study found that people are becoming less interested in edibles than they were a year or 2 years ago. Do you think that's a short-term phenomenon? I mean, really, they're not in the market today. Maybe people are just losing interest because they're not present and other things are present. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I got to say, so I was presenting to investors this week in Montreal, people looking at the cannabis space very seriously. There was lots of money in the room, and I was presenting our results, and of course our results weren't necessarily great if you're an investor, but I did say one thing. I think we're at the start of a 10-year cycle when it comes to stigma and regulations. I think we've bottomed in terms of enthusiasm. 2 years ago, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm around cannabis because it was an unknown. Now it is around us, and I think people have calmed down. You even look at the cannabis space across the country. Most companies in Canada that are growing cannabis are spending a lot of time overseas, to be honest. I mean, if you talk to companies like Canopy or Exo, they are spending a lot of time in Europe and elsewhere just because growth is going to be there, and eventually that's going to catch up to us. And at some point we're going to have to figure out how to regulate edibles in particular. If you can't really continue to treat edibles like a drug, because who's going to surveil edibles? The CFIA is completely out of the equation right now. And so Health Canada is basically going to surveil edibles, and it doesn't have the capacity. So I do expect to see some issues over the next couple of years, and some adjustments will be required. So what I told investors this week in Montreal was, well, if you're looking at the cannabis space, start looking at it right now. Start to do some R&D work right now, because I suspect it is going to expand at some point. Look at Colorado, where they're basically at 50-50 between the dry cannabis and edibles. So. Well,
and speaking of Colorado, I was reading that they now have about 60% of cannabis sales go to the legitimate market, and 40% go to the black market, or the legacy market, I've heard the industry like to call it now. So, I mean, that is a big platform of public policy, right, is eliminating the black market and actually having the product safer than it is, or certainly more reliable, plus another bunch of things. So what you're describing is a regulatory gap in edibles between, without the being involved. I like your comment about patient money. I had an interview with Tom Dyke, the president and CEO of Mihi Cannabis, and his point was, if you're getting into this industry, you need patient money because this is, as you say, a 10-year, not an overnight success, right? It is a 10-year build.
Well, I think the future, what the government is forcing the industry to do is to actually enter partnerships and working with other companies. XO is a perfect example. Just to go back to them with Molson Coors, they've created a co-enterprise in the fall to come up with a cannabis infused beverage. We can't call it beer, but a beverage of some sort. And they're planning to release a few products over the next 12 months. Those are the kinds of things I expect to see over the next little while. More partnerships.
Last question in the cannabis space, then we'll move on to talking about Canada's new food guide. What's your thinking around long-term consumer acceptance of beverages and edibles? Do you think is it a 10-year when they become make a mark in the consumer consumption, and do you think that those sales are going to come from somewhere else? In other words, they're going to erode whether it's spirits or alcohol or other beverages. How do you see them making their mark in Canadians' households?
Well, so based on our findings, the intent to substitute is very low. In fact, most people are starting to their rates are lower than 2 years ago, and so I think people are committed to their favorite drinks for now. It doesn't mean it's going to stay that way, but for now, I know that the wine industry, for example, in Ontario, BC, we're concerned about about substitution because we have seen some of that going on in the United States, but they're less concerned, and of course, given how restrictive the framework is around edibles, they don't have to worry for a while.
All right.
Yeah. But the black market is going to be around. The problem with such a strict framework is that you could actually see the black market expand even further, just because the human body wasn't necessarily designed to inhale drugs. It's much easier, and even Health Canada recommends people to eat cannabis for medicinal purposes. And so people will be curious and will be tempted, and of course, if they look around, they're going to have to probably purchase from the black market.
Talk about a regulatory gap there. If you have regulatory gaps around legal, legitimate product, I think, overall, one, not mistake, but the one underestimation is the black market is not, will respond in a business way, right? They're going to respond to a strategic challenge. Right now, it seems to be lowering prices, Ben, but their floor production cost is infinitely lower. They have none of the regulations. So
and if you talk to Health Canada, they're very pleased with. They don't necessarily have that on their radar. All they care about is to make sure that during the election in the fall, they won't find out that there's a 5-year-old kid who ingested accidentally a cannabis-infused chocolate bar, ended up in the hospital. That's the last thing they want.
It's interesting, and I'll end on this point. It's with this question. It seems the federal government neither got the praise nor the criticism. It's a fairly bold move, right, in terms of legalization First Nation and the G20. So they seem to not get the credit for that, but at the same time, they seem to not. It seems like a neutral topic amongst Canadians. I guess we'll see how that fleshes out in the fall.
Yeah, the way I would articulate Canada's role in cannabis around the world is that we are first, but I don't think we're leaders yet, or we're assuming our leadership. Not yet, anyway. I don't see it at this point.
We'll be right back.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Join me at Store 2019. I'll be delivering a keynote titled From a Place to Buy to the Place to Be, how bricks can counter clicks by focusing on selling moments versus simply peddling merchandise. I then lead into an incredible panel discussion with 3 industry titans talking about the reinvention and reimagination of Staples Canada. Joining me is David Boone, the CEO, Joe Jackman from Jackman Reinvents, and Dragon Joe Mimran, who will talk about this incredible story and leave you with actionable insights and ideas for your business. Store 2019, we'll see you there.
Karl Littler, welcome to the Voice of Retail.
Thanks for having me.
You know, sitting in your office, I'm reminded of that great Tragically Hip song, Wheat Kings. And the quote is, with pictures of our parents' prime ministers. And I think of that when I sit here because you have a long history of work in the political realm. You didn't come to Retail Council of Canada without great experience. So why don't we start talking a little bit about your background and how you came to Retail Council of Canada?
Well, it's interesting that you should mention the Tragically Hip because I saw them first in 1988 at the Flamingo in Halifax when I was in law school. And I suppose that law school was one of the things that impelled me into this space, although I was already involved from undergrad in politics and had an interest even as a kid. I used to watch British general elections before immigrating to Canada. It was one of the few days of the year on which I was allowed to stay up past 8:30. So it's always been in my blood, I guess.
A special event in the Littler household.
It was.
It's a general election.
And of course, it being a British election, you always had the monster raving loony party for comic relief.
I missed that from the Canadian political spectrum. Well, we kind of have it, but that takes us down a different path. So tell us then how you wound up here. What's your background in government affairs and what not makes you suited for the role, but what makes you really good at what you do?
Well, I mean, obviously, beauty here is in the eye of the beholder. I'm not sure that I'm invariably good at what I do, but I like to think in general I'm not bad at it. So I was on the other side of the table for an extended period. I worked in finance in Paul Martin's office. I worked in the Prime Minister's office subsequent to that. And I focused a fair bit on tax policy and also financial sector issues. So after that, I did a few things, including some democracy projects in Iraq and Ukraine. I then joined a consulting firm in government relations, a prominent one. Maybe I shouldn't mention them. Maybe I should. I don't know. Strategy Corp. The chairman at the time I was hired is now our ambassador to Washington, David McNaughton. Had a diverse range of files across energy, across finance, across transportation. And one of my clients developed into the space of the Retail Council of Canada. So they were, as we now are, we're facing an issue with overcharging credit card interchange fees, and they were looking for somebody to help them with that project. It was obviously and remains a pretty significant issue for merchants, $5 billion in the retail space, $7 billion overall in interchange costs annually. Got engaged in a number of other files for RCC over the course of time, and at a certain point RCC was looking to hire a new head of government relations, and so they came knocking on my door, and I decided that I would go in-house rather than work as a service provider.
So you understand the workings at the highest level of government. You understand client issues. And you talked about credit card issues being one of the main issues for retailers in Canada. That's a long-standing issue. It's a good transition. Let's talk about what, for 2019, would you think would be the top issues for retailers at the national level? Of course, I understand that you have files both at the municipal, provincial, and federal level, but let's talk about the federal level. And what are those big picture issues?
Well, I think interestingly, I mean, it's a federal election year, so obviously that brings a whole pile of creativity into the space of platform writing, not just for the incumbent government, but also all of the parties that are contending for power after the 2019 election. So we'll see quite a bit unfold over the course of the year. I don't think we can from the vantage point of early May, necessarily say that we know the sort of full range of issues. Certainly, one of them is the ongoing uncertainty with respect to Nafta or the U.S.-Canada free trade, U.S.-Canada-Mexico free trade arrangement, by whichever acronym.
Or CUMSA.
Yeah,
right?
It's CUSMA on this side of the border. It's like USMA or something like that on the U.S. side of the border.
Such a big issue. What influence or what role does RCC have to play with the federal government, who's negotiating such a huge trade agreement with multiple countries? What role do we have? We have and continue to be been very engaged on a few issues. I wouldn't say that we have the full range of NAFTA within our contemplation. Obviously, things like automotive, content rules are not sort of big in our space. But we had a few points of entry. And I would say that our primary point of entry was around the issue of ensuring fair treatment of imported parcel shipments, basically bought from online vendors outside Canada. We were very concerned by a U.S. demand to increase the threshold before taxes and duties would apply. And clearly that would have created an imbalance. Essentially, you've then got two different forms of tax treatment for the same goods. This is this de minimis issue we've talked about.
We call it de minimis. That comes from a Latin maxim, de minimis non curat lex, which is the law does not concern itself with trifles or with trivia.
Sure.
And it was originally designed to alleviate very small parcels or
handling of small stuff that's not worthwhile.
The cost that would arise from handling the calculation of customs duties. But with Canada having a federal sales tax, they don't have one in the U.S. The issue became more complicated, and so currently Canada exempts parcels under $20. And we understand why they exempt parcels under $20. There is an inherent unfairness, obviously, but you don't want to be spending a vast amount of government resources or for that matter, individual resources on calculating duties, using the customs tariff, applying taxes to parcels that cost $10. It's just not worth the time. But the U.S. has used this to try and drive a significant advantage because it has so much scale and was the sort of primary first mover in the online space. They've tried to get everybody else to open up to product shipped out of the U.S. on a tax and duty-free basis. Clearly that creates an existential threat for retailers, and what the U.S. was asking for was something more in line with their own level, which is $800 U.S. minimum, although that will change under the new treaty. So you're talking something in excess these days of $1,000 Canadian. Well, as you can imagine, the overwhelming bulk of retail sales fit into that space. So imagine, Canadian merchants, whether in bricks and mortar or online, selling any goods value below $1,000.
Charging taxes, and those taxes pay for our roads.
Well, not only
and
charging
healthcare.
taxes, I'm paying duties as these products are imported to Canada, where they're imported, and then paying taxes collecting taxes on top of that. Obviously, that creates a huge price differential, and customers are going to obviously respond to that price differential. So, it threatened a great deal of unfairness, was frankly an incentive to shop literally anywhere but here, and is a bit curious. Governments are occasionally accused of favoring the home team, whether that's through non-tariff barriers or other means. This was the opposite. This was actually promising to punish the home side, the people who employ 2 million in Canadian retail, all the people making investments here. They would have been the ones getting the short end of the stick. So we were quite engaged with the Canadian government. It took a little bit of time to educate some parts of the government to understand our position. We were wrestling with, something that looked to be a quick and easy gimme for consumers, even though it would have created a great deal of unfairness.
That was the bit of the nub of the challenge, right? Is that on the surface of it, before you dig deeper, the consumers would go, wait, so I get to pay no taxes on goods. That sounds okay to me, at the very surface of it, right? explaining the fact that then it affects the jobs of people who hire your kids is a whole other different discussion.
And I mean, some people certainly understood that, and there were umpteen media stories on this file, and you looked in the comments section underneath, and you had everything from give it to me tax-free, give it to me now.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, people are saying, well, that doesn't seem very reasonable if Canadian merchants are going to have to pay duties and collect taxes, and offshore warehouse sellers are not. So we had quite a range of views. The file did not come up for the very first time in the Nafta renegotiation context. It's something that had been brought up by U.S. freight companies and by a few other entities, including eBay, who were pushing, obviously, for an advantage for themselves in the space. For the air freight companies, of course, the motivation is
move more freight.
We'll move more parcels if those parcels are tax-free, because people will be ordering more online and less in bricks. Well, more online from south of the border and less from either Canadian bricks and mortar or Canadian online vendors. So we took some time to educate policymakers on that. And there were several stabs taken at this by the U.S. air freight industry in particular over a number of...
At very senior levels, right?
At very senior levels.
In the U.S. at Congress level, sure. And even with the NAFTA negotiation team.
And this was prior even to the NAFTA negotiations. So we had frankly won this fight several years ago, having had both conservative and liberal governments in series decline this push to exempt more. And so we felt that we were sort of, away to the races. And then President Trump decided that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. And one of the demands was this huge increase in tax and duty-free status for imported parcel shipments. So we spent a lot of time talking both at the public service level, at the political level.
At the provincial level as well, because the provinces were involved in this.
We did talk to the provinces, and some of them were quite helpful to us because they understood the implications for, all of the bricks and mortar stores, and for that matter, some of the online warehouse and distribution center investments being made in their communities. And frankly, they had skin in the game. Because if it comes in tax-free, it also means that no provincial taxes are being collected, and so there was significant amount of money at risk.
And I'm for the listeners, I'm going deep on this one. We're going deep on this one because I think it's a great case to illustrate what Retail Council of Canada does and what you do, and how you have dialogues at different levels of government. And it's been said sometimes that what the work is around explaining unintended consequences in some things, right? So, on the surface, it seems, I don't think anyone thought it harmless, but, explaining the full range of actual consequences is a full-time job. So that's why I'm kind of going deep on this.
Well, one of the challenges in politics typically is, not seeing the forest for the trees.
Well, all right, thanks to Sinead, Sylvain, and Karl for being my guests in this episode. Now, let's hit the highlights in Retail This Week e-newsletter, biggest retail weekly e-newsletter in Canada. You can subscribe on retailcouncil.org for free. It's kind of a companion piece, so to speak, to the Voice of Retail podcast. This is where I kind of grab most of my headlines or what's been in the news in Canada and around the world. Put that together for Retail Council of Canada each and every week. Kicking off with actually an article from Sylvain, who we just heard from earlier in the podcast, talking about how retailers are doubling down on delivery. This is in the Halifax Chronicle, where Sylvain is based. And he talks about the race, basically, so to speak, for e-grocery. This picture here, not surprisingly, is Sobeys or Empire Food based out in the East Coast of Voila, which is Sobeys' new delivery. So anyway, he just speaks to how really trying to catch up, grocers trying to catch up to the modern consumer. From there, we move to Endy. So there's an article here from Strategy Magazine, View from the C-Suite, Endy stays the course. Basically, if you may remember, we covered it on the podcast, Endy was purchased by Sleep Country. Good decision, as it kind of a nice variety, adds variety and different channels for them. Now, interestingly, in the article, it talks about Sleep Country's Bloom mattress, which is basically that they're one and the same, certainly not the same product, but Sleep Country is their Bloom is Sleep Country's mattress. Anyway, it talks about how Bloom has got multiple variations, but Endy staying the course with basically a single SKU available in other sizes. So really kind of a stripped down model, which certainly is working for them. Congratulations goes out to Roots. Roots Canada is opening up a fabulous store. Some pictures here from the Chicago Times, actually, on the Mink Mile, which is one of those milestone, bespoke shopping districts, if you don't know of it, in Chicago. And it's actually, according to this article, the first store to open up there in 6 months. So congratulations to Roots, and look forward to hearing more about that from James Connell and the entire team at Roots. From the Globe and Mail, more articles about Ontario moving to reforming the alcohol sales. And there's been a long push over many years from getting beer, for example, out of just simply the brewer's retailer, or the beer store as it's now known, and LCBO, and out into the grocers where it's very common across the country. Different provinces have it available, but that's kind of new for Ontario, so that continues, and Retail Council of Canada works on that as well. What else we got from lots of great articles here. Check it out in this on the website, and you'll hear from Tony Chapman. Steve Dennis has got an article he just posted. You'll hear from Steve next week on day 2 of Story. Kicks off the morning. Looking forward to that presentation. Article here from Joe Jackman. And again, all these articles are exclusively available on retailcouncil.org. Great news coming out of Retail Council as well. Willie Crew, KPMG, his partner and global chair, is been named the Canadian Retail Hall of Fame. Such a great achievement. A great leader, global leader, and a leader for retailers in Canada. Congratulations to Willie. We'll be feting him on the evening of the 28th in Toronto. So if you're around, be sure and get your tickets to that wonderful gala. It's a great networking opportunity, a lot of fun. From BNN, Canadian retail sales posted biggest gain in 10 months in March. So interesting stats, in as much as when you peel them back, it talks about retail sales rose 1.1% in March. And that's the biggest gain month over month, I think, in 10 years. I think it gives a little too much credit to what is in those numbers. And when Stats Canada and then media report these numbers, in the retail numbers are automotive and gas. And gas alone, I peeled back the numbers a little bit, went up 6-7%. So that would really drive overall retail sales up. Gas is about a $50 billion annual purchase. So we're going to take some time to look at those numbers and maybe get back to you next week to see exactly what happened in the month of March. From around the world, a great article here from Forbes from Steve Dennis. Again, Steve will be here in town. I'll get him on the podcast actually next week as well. Looking forward to that. Kohl's, JCPenney, and the relentless collapse of retail's boring middle. Steve doesn't really hold out much hope for these stores. It's interesting. There's a Robin report on Kohl's kind of celebrating some of the things they're doing. I'm not sure Mr. Dennis agrees. And JCPenney, really, we're all just waiting for the penny to drop. Though there's a story later out of Dallas, and it's based in Dallas, which actually where Steve is based, with a new CEO saying there's no silver bullet and the turnaround will take time. So I guess we can only wish them the best of luck, but I'm not sure I'm wildly optimistic about their chances for the future. Nordstrom cuts 2019 forecast after quarterly results miss big. This from Reuters. I saw the Nordstrom, Blake Nordstrom in Las Vegas earlier this year, and he was a little bit surprised or taken back by the deceleration in his business. They're doing all the right things, for sure. They're doing some innovative store pickup strategies and small store strategies. They say in this article, results were hurt by the rollout of a new loyalty program and slow sales of full-priced women's clothing. He does make the point that the Rack, which is their off-price, is really very successful, and he doesn't find it brand eroding. He actually generates most of his new customers from the Rack, but interesting kind of counterpoint in this article. From CNN article around reusable packaging coming to Walgreens and Kroger. So we've reported on that from Metro running a pilot where you could bring your own containers for bulk food. So we're I think going to see much more of that in the months and years to follow. Turning to retail news for entrepreneurs, we got an article here from Saskatchewan. Flip that pot permit. This is from the CBC. 10 out of 29 operating Saskatchewan retail cannabis stores have actually flipped their permit to different owners or something. The latest being a Tweed opening up a store. Basically, a lot of consolidation going on in the Saskatchewan market. So we'll keep a close eye on that. And in grocery retail stories, a bunch of stories. Healthy Planet, a feature article from Craig Patterson's Retail Insider, talking about how that organization is building on a base of 25 locations and is planning to grow. So that's a good article to read, and it's good to see growth along with many other things. Article here on Whole Foods cracking down on plastic waste. Not surprising, Whole Foods would take that stance. That's really their pedigree. This from Canadian Grocer, and of course you'll get to hear me, first of all, Walter Robb, former co-CEO Walter Robb, on the stage at Store 2019, and I'll be interviewing Walter for the back half of his presentation, chitting and chatting about things like Amazon, and being that only one of us on that stage has ever sold the company to Amazon, I thought it'd be a great opportunity to talk to him about it. Article here from the province out on the west coast. Sobeys continue to open their Freshcos out in BC, so they're really taking their value-priced offering out there. I suspect that will be very popular. A lot of price pressure or disposable income or just income pressure out in Vancouver on the west coast. Very high price of gasoline, which tends to, as I said earlier, gasoline prices have gone up, which makes retail look good, but in some ways, if not all, it does take more money in the tank. It's going to take more money out of consumers' pockets for all kinds of commodities. Last article in Grocery, Blue Apron continues to suffer. And there's been there's a run up in a number of different food kit delivery services. Blue Apron's a bit of a poster child, or whatever you want to call it in terms of looking at the index of how those meal kits are going to perform. According to this article from the Washington Post, their customer base fell 25% to 557,000 customers between 2017 and 2018. And so, we'll see, it's all public information since their IPO. So we'll wish them and the entire category all the best, but we'll keep an eye on that. It may have a shorter life than we thought, but at the other hand, it is a compelling value proposition. So we'll see how it all sorts out in the months and years to come. That's a wrap for this edition of The Voice of Retail. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform, and be sure and recommend it to a friend or colleague in the retail industry. You can also ask your favorite home devices, Amazon Echo, Google Home, Siri, Cortana, to play the most recent edition. I'm Michael LeBlanc, founder and president of M.E. LeBlanc Company, and you can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co or, of course, on LinkedIn. If you're in Toronto attending Store 2019 next week, be sure and stop by the Purolator Podcast Studio and share your Store 2019 insights for the Voice of Retail special conference editions that I'm going to be doing next week. And join me again next week for the regular Friday edition. We'll have part 2 of my interview with Sylvain Charlebois talking about Canada's new food guide and the impact on grocery merchants, and Karl Littler as we continue to dive into the top line issues for retailers across the nation. So until then, have a great week.